Hello and welcome back to Watching Brief for the week of the 2nd of October 2023. The spooky season is upon us, autumn is undeniable at this point, and the dark encroaches as we approach the winter. How are you finding these dark evenings, Andy? I believe, and we've just checked as well, that apparently sunset is earlier with you than it is with me, which feels kind of
Which is a bit
counterintuitive. Yeah.
It is counterintuitive, but I'll take your word for it.
Yeah.
You've just checked in the almanacs.
Mm.
I have to say, autumn is pretty much my favourite season. I grew up on a farm, and so autumn was, as well as being the season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, the fruitfulness was literal because we were picking the apples and the pears and the soft fruit and so on the farm where I grew up. And still, to me, that's what autumn's all about. It's about harvest. It's about fecundity. It's about soft light in the evenings. I'm sorry, I'm sounding horribly romantic here, aren't I? But no, and obviously later on in the autumn, we're about a third of the way through now, but later on in the autumn, we get those fantastic festivals, those cultural festivals that go back millennia to do with the cycle of life and death, the Day of the Dead in Mexico, and so on, and which really acts as the cue for the Watching Brief discussion we're about to have in a moment. Do you see what I did there?
I do see what you did there. Yeah. So this week, folks, our Watching Brief continues in the form of a conversation. We've invited Professor Howard Williams, a longtime friend of the show, on to talk about, in the first instance, Sycamore Gap and the loss of the tree that I touched on last week briefly, and how it relates to landscape and memory and liminal spaces and culture and life and death cycles and all this kind of thing. But also as well, we couldn't resist asking Howard while we had him about an interesting story, shall we say, to do with a body in the United States. But you'll have to hang around to see what that's about. But yeah,
but it does expose, I think, some fascinating cultural and ethical issues, particularly for those of us that work in archaeology and heritage.
I think so. Anyway, with no further ado, this is what we got up to with Howard a little earlier today.
The main discussion on this week's Watching Brief is about a news story that really went international last weekend. And it refers to what is called the Sycamore Gap tree on Hadrian's Wall in the north of England, in the Northumbria National Park, actually on Hadrian's Wall. You might know the Sycamore Gap tree if you've ever seen the film Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. It's the tree that Robin Hood and his new bestie, back from the Crusades, visit on their way back to Nottingham via Beachy Head on the south coast. It's Hollywood geography at its absolute finest.
Yeah.
But it was an iconic tree. It was a single tree, very spectacularly symmetrical, or more or less symmetrical, sat in this this dip at the central section of Hadrian's Wall. And in the middle of the night last week, it was felled very professionally with a chainsaw. It had been there, it's estimated, for around about 300 years. It was absolutely iconic. It was the kind of place where people would propose to their partners, would leave loved ones' ashes. It was absolutely embedded into the local visual and oral and practical culture, really, of that part of Northumberland. To discuss it and the way people reacted, we've got Marc, Mr. Soup himself, who on this occasion is speaking really as a resident of the northeast of England. He lives just down the road, almost literally, from the Sycamore Gap, and from Hadrian's Wall. And we're also joined by friend of the show, Professor Howard Williams of the University of Chester. Howard, we've asked on because of his expertise really in, strange death-related, memorialization-related archaeological stuff, and also liminal spaces. He's done a lot of work on the border around Offa's Dyke, on the Welsh-English border. So I think we couldn't think of two better people really to have a sort of initial discussion about what happened with the Sycamore Gap tree, and why perhaps people reacted in the way they do, and perhaps how we might move forward from it, both as archaeologists and actually as humans who care about our environment, because it's been very clear that many of the people who've responded to what happened uh, have done so at a very visceral, emotional level. And the other thing, just before we start, I need to make clear we're not going to speculate about how the tree came to be felled or why, simply because there's a live police investigation. And at the time of recording, there have been two arrests, one of a 16-year-old who and another of I think it was a 62-year-old man, both of whom have been arrested and then bailed pending further police inquiries. So we won't be speculating on anything to do with who they are or why anybody might have done what happened. But I'll start with Marc as the person who was closest to where this happened. How did you find out about the Sycamore Gap and what had happened at Sycamore Gap?
Word of mouth, word of mouth. It was just going round. It was very quickly in the community. I'm here in North Tyneside, and I said on on the day after on a short video that even people who were just working the land, so there were a couple of council workers who were mowing a verge, were clearly talking about this and clearly dumbfounded as to why this would happen. I suppose it's given that it has been about a week. Something that really that I found fascinating is how people have had such different responses to this in terms of what it represents as a loss. In that sense, the tree isn't dead. The stump is still live, and it's likely to sprout. And in that sense, it may just act as a coppice tree for a while. But also, as well, other people across the country, and Howard obviously can hopefully speak to this a little bit in just a second, seem to have responded either with deep nostalgia and a sense of loss that they can't quite put into words, or I've had a lot of people commenting, yeah, well, what about all the trees that have been lost in HS2? And that's been interesting. That no matter what the response has been one of trees are important. I suppose my initial response to that second point is that this wasn't a scheduled felling. This wasn't in the way of infrastructure, and the land hadn't been purchased for that purpose, and hence it is a surprising loss, especially for such an iconic tree. Anyway, what do you make of it, Howard? I mean, a couple of years ago, did we lose a very old tree on Offers Dyke, I think?
I believe so, yes. And there is an ongoing project, sort of a an individual project to record all the historic trees on the line of Offa's Dyke. So the association of our great ancient and early medieval linear earthworks and trees as an integral part of their story, not of the time of the frontier, but of the afterlife, is already a feature. And the link between Offa's Dyke and Hadrian's Wall is, of course, the long distance national trails. So people associate both monuments with different times in history, different parts of our island story, conflict, and the redundancy of those walls now, in a sense. But also they associate them with leisure, landscape, and the passing of time, and histories embody that. So for me, I thought I wanted to do a sort of response to it, because you can't respond to everything that happens on social media, but I did a quick rapid TikTok video, just saying that I thought I was a bit edgy, in the sense that I said this is a heritage crime, because I wanted people to think about what is damage to an ancient monument and a UNESCO World Heritage Site landscape context. And I was trying to make the point that trees are such an important part of that too. So I did lead with a sort of perhaps a presumptuous assertion, not knowing anything about the precise legal status of the tree, anything about the precise circumstances, and I don't want to speculate about that either. But I wanted people to think about this issue, and it got a bit of a unexpectedly viral response. And people were angry at the loss of the tree, aware of it just being one isolated tree, but because of its association with Hadrian's Wall, association with a national trail, association with Northumberland and its national park, and a sense of local and regional identity, as Marc eloquently has already expressed, and a sense that this is so incongruous, because why would you do that? Anyone who knows anything about the landscape knows this is a tree that you have to make a walk to. It's not sitting next to a car park or and it's not readily accessible to anyone who would have to go that distance, walk so far from the nearest access point to fell it. And so the reactions were anger, sadness, and then on both sides, reactions to other trees lost. And this reflects the many councils and building projects that have destroyed our natural landscape. This is yet another example. It makes me very angry. And the opposite, what about all these other trees? This is just one.
Before we explore this in more detail, I think it might help our viewer if we give a little bit of context to this, certainly from a British point of view, and maybe a cultural Northern European point of view. Obviously, recently we have seen Plymouth Council, for example, and Sheffield Council both getting into trouble for felling trees within an urban landscape. And at the same time, we celebrate the Sycamore Gap trees now gone, but we still celebrate the Boscobel oak, which is the oak tree that Charles II is supposed to have hidden in after the Battle of Worcester. And famously, I mentioned Robin Hood earlier on with Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. We have the major oak in Sherwood Forest, which is alleged to be contemporaneous with certainly, shall we say, the growth of the Robin Hood legends in the Middle Ages, and is now basically barely alive and propped up. It's on life support, and there are ongoing debates about whether it's possible to retain it in its current form for much longer. But that is almost reflecting a tradition that goes right back into prehistory, doesn't it, Howard? Because I'm thinking, for example, of the oak groves that Tacitus mentions on the island of Innis Anglesey, that are destroyed by the Romans in AD 60.
So that spiritual quality to specific trees that are ancient or of particular species or in particular locations did chime. I accidentally misinformed based on not doing my research properly and doing a rapid video in a 10-minute slot between lectures, that I said it was a medieval tree, and I did a correction video about that point. But regardless, people knew it wasn't a particularly old tree, and it's around 300 years old, I believe. But my point in my follow-up video was that while I was inaccurate and misleading in echoing inaccurate preliminary news reports, at least two I saw, they said the tree was medieval. I said that my point would be, and this isn't just a get out, I admitted I was wrong, but in many ways, because of the Robin Hood film, that tree is medieval in the popular imagination. And even though it was only 32 years since that film was released, for many younger people on social media, the tree is a before time. It's a primordial feature. It may be only, and it's certainly, and the other point I made is that it's certainly older than the Hadrian's walls conserved 19th century appearance, which is what we've inherited along many of those central stretches. So no one would dare to say that Hadrian's Wall is not real because it's been heavily conserved since the 19th century. Likewise, I was saying that this tree is very old, and that's why people care. It's isolated, aesthetic, it's linked to all those different interconnected heritage significances of the wall, but also because of this sort of sense of antiquity that it embodies as an isolated, almost sacred tree. I don't think anyone was going there worshipping or imagining it was somewhere where a druid was lurking, but in a rational way. But I think it had that quality linked to this tradition that you mentioned. Yes.
I think certainly one of the things that strikes me is that to any living human being, in that sense, the tree is essentially timeless. It's we can't relate to its lifespan, even though it's relatively young. So its absence is absolutely significant. Andy.
I was going to ask both of you really how you react to the idea that, as well as obviously, there is a sense that there was a collective ownership culturally of this living thing, of this of this tree. But one of the things I got from it as well is there obviously there's the question why, and as I said, we're not going to speculate about that. But there is, I think, a sense that this object in the landscape, this beautiful object in the landscape, which we've seen so many photographs since the felling story went live, shots of the just recently of the Aurora Borealis, seen through the Sycamore Gap with the tree framed in front, silhouetted in front. Really powerful, visceral images of nature.
Yes.
But there was the sense that this was being protected and curated for us. The site is owned by the National Trust. The Hadrian's Wall is protected by Historic England. It's a World Heritage Site. This just should not have happened. So I get the sense of a real sense of contemporary injustice about this as well, that almost the tree has been let down. Marc?
It's been let down in more ways than one, I suppose. No, it has been let down, and it's been well, it's been attacked. It's been attacked, and it's been felled in a way that wasn't planned, that wasn't sanctioned, that wasn't expected, and that has irrevocably changed the landscape. I mean, for every time I go back to Vindolanda now, or go to Housesteads or something, I'm going to go through that landscape, look to my right or to my left on the way home, and see the gap. I won't see the tree. I hope to visit it when the tree is visitable again. At the moment, it should be said that the National Trust are asking people not to go to the site as much as possible. But I'm also hopeful that the tree will rise again. In that sense, the initial reports that the tree may well have been permanently lost were slightly overstated. The base of the tree appears to be healthy. Obviously, there's going to be a focus on making sure that it continues to be healthy, and hopefully it'll start to grow within our lifetimes to some sort of bush-like size. But also as well, it should be said, the felling of the tree has also damaged that section of wall. I think it was revealed this morning, if not yesterday, yes, that there has been some damage to the wall. So the police investigation will have to take that into account, presumably. And also as well, I mean, Andy alluded to this fact that that spot is a place where people go to have photographs, get married, scatter ashes, so on and so forth. I don't know if you guys recall, but a few years ago now, there was a fairly frantic call by the National Trust to try and find some chemical solution to dealing with an epoxy-like substance that had been used to glue a plaque. I think an Australian gentleman had died, and his friends had affixed this plaque to Hadrian's Wall because he'd always wanted to go there. And so I think it will be the story of the tree and its felling that will augment and add to that moment when we go to that part of the wall. I think it's still going to be Sycamore Gap. There's just more gap than there is sycamore now.
The other thing that struck me, Howard, is that this is almost moving into the territory of the Glastonbury Abbey Christthorn, which has gone through various iterations and been felled, and cuttings have been taken and so on in the course of its life. It's associated, of course, with the legend of Joseph of Arimathea visiting the southwest during the lifetime of Christ. And you go to Glastonbury today, and you still see the Christthorn, which is, by legend, blossoms at Christmas.
Yes.
And do you think that's a reasonable analogy?
I think it is, in the sense, well, it doesn't have the same sacred landscape of early Christianity associations, and but we are seeing that play out, aren't we? And particularly given the secular, it's a deathscape. It's a place where ashes are scattered. It's a place where marriage proposals are enacted. It's the reason people care, and I think the lesson for heritage is the reason people care so much about this incident is not its particular age or just the aesthetics, but the fact this is part of a living evolving, integrated practice that's not elite. The National Trust, the British Museum, every time they're mentioned, we go, but this is a part of a landscape in a region that has seen heavy, deprivation over since, well, during and subsequent to, in the Industrial Revolution, where this is part of one of the few accessible landscapes for large regions of those sort of working class areas. This is not part of just some white upper and middle class, fancy. A lot of people can buy into this. And when I saw the snide reactions to this, because with every news story there's, oh, why do people only care it's a tree? It's really interesting to see how all the hot takes about how this doesn't just matter, it'll grow again. It's easy to do that, but if this was something more, if it wasn't a tree or a pub, but it was a country house, those some of those voices would be happy to be outraged and blame, and even when it is in such a working class landscape, the number of people who wanted to blame the failings on somebody's lack of education or an inner city oik, or the volume of comments like that I received was really shocking. Everyone wants to blame the poor, shall we say? Everyone wants to blame the young, and in that regard, I have to do. I know we don't want to go into the speculation game, but of course, people were fixated in the reactions to my video on the who to blame. And I must say, I was shocked to see how the algorithm on TikTok ran with that as a search bar algorithm created search, which was just stop oil, cut down the Sycamore Gap. So I had to do a follow-up video to counter that view, because everyone coming to my video was seeing that, and even though I said nothing about eco protest, they were being driven into this conspiracy theory territory by the algorithm, as well as individual willful idiots in the comment section going, it's the kind of thing they would have done even if there's no evidence they did do it. So no smoke without fire. And that was really scary to see how quickly people wanted to blame people. Anyway, whatever your views on those matters, I found it really scary to see how that blame game played out, an algorithm provoked.
Well, and yet it does seem to be something that is a little bit above that, in especially again the reactions I've seen locally and on the local news, and when going out and about, is that as far as I can tell, people aren't really looking for the most part, I think people are presuming that they know who's to blame, or they know one or two people might be to blame. But the speculation about it's eco this or oil that doesn't really seem to be filtering down locally, or even looking for whatever demographic you might want to blame. It could be because I remember even when I was a kid, I used to hear people say teenagers. Oh, yeah. That's not really what's floating around. What seems to be floating around is a sense of loss. I mean, the sort of local newspaper of record, the Chronicle, went with a headline that said that that was our tree. And the thing is, though, it's difficult, isn't it, not to draw somewhat romantic, slightly sort of pagan kind of connections to this sort of incident, because it's elicited such an emotional response that it immediately makes you think of losses of other great trees, and even slightly mythical losses, like the idea of was it Charlemagne popping over to England to chop down a sacred tree in England or something. But it's I don't mind that in this instance. There's been an awful lot of recent work in and around Hadrian's Wall in the past couple of decades, in particular, to look for so-called softer history, to look for how people talk about the landscape as much as what's actually there. So, for example, there were stories that were being collected last time I was aware of this about a witch who lived in a hole, and this hole clearly was not from that time, and clearly was nothing, but this had come about, this had accumulated, and sort of the gravity of the wall had attracted these stories to it. And I think I described it in my TikTok. I described it as a psychic bedrock, a psychic anchor point for people in the Northeast, and it kind of is. I mean, I would push back ever so slightly on it being truly accessible. People in the West End, for example, of Newcastle, don't necessarily have easy access to that part of Hadrian's Wall, but you can get there. You can walk to it, and lots of school trips go to Vindolanda, which is just right next to Sycamore Gap. And even if you can't get there, for example, where I live in Wallsend, just knowing that you're on Hadrian's Wall and that the tree is over there somewhere is powerful. And hopefully, I don't know. Hopefully, moments like this, if you want to think of it as and its so-called eco significance, maybe moments like this will move people to think about what they've got before it's gone, I suppose.
I do feel there's an opportunity for heritage, given the amount of discussion of community archaeology, public archaeology in relation to Hadrian's Wall. And I know we've got colleagues at various universities in the Northeast that have actively developed those initiatives and supported the local authorities and regional authorities and national park. This is an opportunity. It sounds horrible to say capitalize, but there is a real potential here, not only because the tree may not be dead, but also to re-energize a love and care for the broader historic environment, not just Hadrian's Wall per se and the heritage sites. And yes, it's not that accessible when you consider the car park costs, the public transport costs, or whatever it may be. But I think there is a potential here to for decades to come now, to open up these stories of and to break down some of the sort of hierarchy of what is worth seeing in the landscape beyond the stones of the wall and its mile castles and its forts, to think about the broader story of the landscape. And I think that is an opportunity which I think various heritage organizations could capitalize on. And again, sorry about the word capitalize, because it's horrible to think about this, but in terms of making an opportunity. But if we're going to have an opportunity for a conversation about what people care about, this seems like a good one.
Well, to crib from you and your love of Offa's Dyke, maybe people should consider what's on offer. Anyway, Andy.
I was going to say, I think if we're going to go down that route, I better interject. We don't want to be punishing our viewer too much. No. One of the things, again, that struck me in reading the responses, both professional and from what we might call the public, the lay audience that also cares about heritage and archaeology and cares about this tree and what's happened. I think there's a lesson here for people who were involved in the debate about other iconic sites. For example, and the one that sprung to mind immediately is it's the most front and centre at the moment in UK archaeology is Stonehenge and the A303 upgrade and tunnel, which the government at the moment, as we understand it, still plans to proceed with. It's facing another court case as to whether it's lawful or not. But I think that there has been some pushback from some sectors of professional archaeology that people who are professional archaeologists shouldn't be commenting on the potential for damage to the Stonehenge World Heritage Site landscape. That it's all under control. Archaeologists have, any work that's done that would damage the landscape, there'll be preservation in situ or there'll be preservation by record. It's exactly how it's done and so on. So, to be blunt about it, it's sort of pat on the head, don't worry about it, doctor knows best. And personally, I've thought for a long time, and I think the response to Sycamore Gap maybe reinforces that suggestion, at least, that archaeologists would do well to maybe show a little more humility and try to understand why people come from that point of view, where it seems to sort of romanticize the landscape, it seems to almost anthropomorphize the landscape, and the scientific, we're the professionals, we're doing it according to the law. It's actually not quite enough. You need to engage at a more humane level as well.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that oddly enough, I was driving home from the south of England, Andy, not East Midlands, back up to the northeast, and it's a long story.
That's an in joke of yours, Mark. Yeah, Mark visited a town called Bedford the other day, which
Yeah,
I thought was in the sort of southern East Midlands,
I'm
and
pretty sure it was
apparently
the
people of
south.
Bedford.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Anyway, so it doesn't matter.
opinions differ.
I was
Anyway,
driving
yes,
home.
go
I was
on.
driving home, and as I was driving, I was thinking about some of these sorts of conversations actually, where some people turn up and they have really annoying or inaccurate or historically invalid or at times really genuinely full on kooky out there ideas about all manner of things. You know, Stonehenge being a particular magnet for this sort of stuff. But it occurred to me that actually within certain boundaries, it's okay. It's absolutely fine for people to have ideas about the landscape, where, in particular where they live and places that are special to them. They are exploring essentially a thought bubble that surrounds these places, and far be it from us to put that thought bubble into a box and insist that people only think about, about genuine auxiliaries and soldiers from the Netherlands, and don't think about Julius Caesar when you go to Hadrian's Wall, this kind of thing. That's really important, and I know that you've done work yourself and also in conjunction with community groups around Offers Dyke. Do you find similar things occurring there? Do you think is there a particular sort of locus of weird ideas?
I mean, not so much weird ideas. Of course, the conflation with the modern political border and the historic border between England and Wales is a challenge. But there's no real. I think there's a lot of willingness and openness on both sides of the modern border to see the linear frontier or the linear monument as part of a complex story. And I've been working, well, not, I've said a bit stretched to say I've been working with, I've been in conversations with and supporting various localities, as has Professor Keith Ray of Cardiff University and other members of the Offers Dyke Collaboratory, our research network, including the Wye Valley area of outstanding natural beauty. To remember, there's also medieval chapels, there's also fascinating stories about the people from the First World War, and the local villages that are affected by, like every village in England and Wales, that every stage of the story of this island can be played out, and the distinctive borderland identities of people who use the Offers Dyke as an anchor or as a reflection on their identities. They may not feel particularly English, but they certainly don't feel Welsh, or they certainly don't feel English, but they don't feel fully Welsh in the way that perhaps Cardiff or Bangor focused discourses might play out. And so I do think that local identities and a range of myths and folklore and legend can be accommodated, and there's no need to do that kind of patronizing, talking down, shouting at people. There's different, it's horses for courses, isn't it? If you're on the internet talking about ancient aliens and Bosnian pyramids, a robust stance against that kind of dangerous, fantastical, and sometimes leading into all manner of supremacist and nationalistic discourses, a robust professional and academic stance is required. In other areas, when you're talking to a local village hall, you can't do that kind of
I mean, you can.
bombastic internet. Well, you can, but it can really backfire on you.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
this is a good example, I think, where I don't know, I haven't really thought out in my mind exactly the relationship between, say, the Sycamore, the Robin Hood tree and in Sycamore Gap and Stonehenge, but it does remind us we've got to be very nuanced in our approaches, and for some people it isn't the stones at Stonehenge. There is a real sort of a nostalgia for bits of early 20th century concrete that mark out Woodhenge or whatever it may be. People do care about other things that don't quite fit into our expectations, and we have to be responsive and respectful of those local and regional stories.
However, one last thought. I don't know if it's occurred to you guys, but every now and then I forget and then I re-remember. I'm from Prestatyn on the end of Offers Dyke, and I live in Wallsend on the end of Hadrian's Wall. I'm destined to be at the end of linear earthworks, it seems.
I've thought about this.
Yeah.
It's not gone unnoticed.
Yeah. Anyway, Andy.
we've only got a couple of minutes left, and I really just wanted to ask both of you. It's that awful end of an interview gotcha question. It's, the last question on any questions or question time where you've got 30 seconds to answer. Marc first, and then maybe Howard as our guest to finish, have the last word. What do you want to happen next at Sycamore Gap, Marc?
I would like for it to be allowed to grow, and for it to be accepted as in potentially a different form. You might even call it possibly mutilated form, but just to let that become the new natural part of the landscape that it is. I think recently we've seen some people, for example, there was a gentleman from Newcastle who went over and planted a new tree close by, and that was removed, I think, quite rightly. We can't just have lots of random people planting essentially a memorial garden there. So let it be and let it grow. That would be my hope.
Howard?
Okay, so in response to my TikTok, I received a flurry of suggestions, from the mildly amusing to the ludicrous, including make a memorial of it the size of a tree but out of metal so it can't be cut down, and all sorts of other actually much more interesting creative suggestions, like maybe the wood from this tree can be used to make sculpture. Something constructive can come out of the dead wood. And then other people suggesting, we could do something with the stump if it didn't survive. But I hope the tree will regrow, and I hope there is some kind of memorial to the act and some kind of lesson that can be integrated into the heritage interpretation.
A watching brief is a formal programme of observation and investigation to record and report on notable discoveries on an archaeological site. As part of our ongoing watching brief, Andy and I work hard to bring you the best, the worst, and sometimes the more quirky happenings from the world of archaeology. We aim to provide a space where voices can be heard, opinions shared, and sometimes truth spoken to power. If you believe in the work we do, please consider supporting us on Patreon for as little as $1 per month. Thank you.
So that is the mystery of the Sycamore Gap, which we'd originally got Howard on to talk about, but then while we were prepping, this is how up to the minute the watching brief can be. I spotted a story on my Twitter, also alternatively known as X, apparently, feed, from the American news outlet ABC, and I clicked through to it and read it, and immediately thought, WTF, we really need to talk about this on the watching brief. And as we've got one of the country's leading experts on the archaeology of death and so on, we couldn't let him go without asking him about it. This is the story of it's described as a mummy, and it's named Stoneman Willie. It's currently in a funeral home in Reading, Pennsylvania, and it is allegedly the mummified, in quote marks, corpse of a probably sort of petty criminal who died of natural causes in the Reading, Pennsylvania jail 128 years ago. For reasons best known to the local historians, which they don't describe in the article, since 1895, this particular person has been, shall we say, under the curatorship and on display, actually, at a local funeral home. But the story is that this Saturday, Stoneman Willie is going to be finally laid to rest in a proper grave, and his identity is going to be revealed in what seems like a sort of reverse baby shower reveal, whereby having reverently laying this person to rest, their name's actually going to be revealed by presumably whipping some sort of cloth off the gravestone or something, so people can see who this actually was. And when I read it, and I passed it straight on to Mark, and then obviously, as I said, we decided we'd ask Howard about it because there's that old joke that Britain and America are two cultures divided by a common language, and because my immediate thought was that couldn't happen here. And then when Mark and I were talking about it, you made the point, Mark, about a particular thing in American funerary culture to do with embalming. Which we don't have to quite the same extent in the UK. So, I mean, Jed, Mark maybe first, and then Hal. What did you make of this story?
Well, I mean, personally, I'm not all that surprised that it exists. That is to say that this situation exists, not the gentleman in question. In so much as I'm a big fan of Ask the Mortician, the YouTube channel. And she's done some excellent work over the years in examining what within the funerary practice and mortuary practice of the US for the past 100-odd years has been very common, and that is the practice of embalming. It turns out that it's, according to this article anyway from ABC News, that Stoneman Willie was an early adopter, or had been adopted at the very least early into this practice, and that's part of the reason why he survives as he does. But what I find fascinating, and this is something that I imagine Howard will probably have an opinion on, is that often in the US, embalming is seen, at the very least it's marketed as, and therefore talked about as, being the most respectful way to treat the dead. It's also a very expensive way to treat the dead, as opposed to just burying them, naturally, as it were, in a coffin in the ground and letting nature take its course. And I mean, is there an argument here that this sort of display is an extension of, it makes me think of saints who were found to be uncorrupted, Cuthbert, etc., in the early Middle Ages. What do you think, Howard? Do you think that there's something actually oddly respectful in this, as opposed to it just being a bizarre, bizarre spectacle, I guess?
Media opportunity for the funeral home was the first thing that sprung to my mind.
I mean, it's difficult to see this as anything respectful, isn't it? And given how much culture in the United States has shifted over the last 50 years towards careful scrutiny around professional museum, heritage and archaeological practice and respecting the dead, it's so out of kilter. And I do wonder, and while I also appreciate many of the morticians and funerary industry people who go public with their YouTube channels and try and burst the bubble and dispel the myths and positively engage with our own mortality, I think much of that content and the historians of medical practice that have made their livings off TV and YouTube are in the same vein. It's really difficult to justify a lot of their behaviours. So what we have here is a poor pickpocket who didn't refuse to give his real name, died in custody, allegedly from natural causes in 1895, and the undertaker petitioned to the state that his body remains until his identity can be identified, which almost in the story is portrayed as an act of, but we did this for free. We gave him an experimental embalming technique for free so that we could identify who it was. And that even Mr. Orman, the founder of the Undertakers, had actually got his name right, they're now claiming. They won't say what it is until they reveal it at the grave. All those years, 128 years, most of that time, therefore, they've known who this is. Or at least heavily guessed. And they claim they've done, through the last few decades, we've done more research. I mean, come on. I mean, you can pay for a DNA test. They could get at some point. Why now? So this is all, I don't believe the story as it's told on the ABC News. I think there's more to it. But also, they were also parading him through the streets in a coffin for the 275th anniversary parade. On the Sunday before the story is released, so it's like the whole.
This is after they've. Yeah, and this is after they've dressed him in a suit with a sort of
Yeah.
sash
So
of office or something.
so he's been a freak show for 128 years,
Mm.
and they're even making a promotional thinly veiled in in with the language of respect, and it's going to be honorable. They're continuing the the um the jamboree, the spectacle of his mummified remains or his embalmed remains, right up to the moment where they finally give him due respectful burial. So, I mean, with having conversed extensively with indigenous archaeologists and from North America and historians. We don't know anything about the ethnicity of this individual other than they're implying indirectly this is a Caucasian white individual, but nothing about this strikes me, regardless of his ethnicity and his religious beliefs. There's nothing strikes me as respectful about this. So I find it, I mean, but that's my judgment. I mean, in terms of a phenomenon, as Mark's, and from an academic point of view,
Mm.
this is another localized example where mummified remains, human remains, are circulating in the States inside the law, in those grey areas. We see the ongoing bone trade through
Mm.
many states of ex-medical skeletons that are sold on TikTok. We're seeing in local undertakers having a bit of, we've got a mummy in the back. It's a weird, strange world. The American relationship with death, the dead, with embalming specifically, as you rightly say, has been such a, it's exported from the States, but it
Mm.
comes from there. So there is, if stepping back, this is one case study of a broader, weird dynamic the Americans have with trying to preserve the body,
Mm.
and bodies that find themselves almost out of place, not fully dead, not fully living, and the fascination of the Americans have with undead fiction, the zombies, vampires. This is part of that relationship. If you wanted to step back from it, but in terms of the way the story is narrated, it doesn't sit well with me at
Mm.
all.
One of the things that struck me reading it again, and obviously we go right back through the literary tradition of novels like Sleepy Hollow from the 19th century, where you've got the undead, the headless horseman, and so on. You've got recent stories about Eastern European vampire tradition being observed in colonial burials. And there's a tradition as well in fairground hucksters displaying the body of so and so gunman who was hanged on Boot Hill and in 1890 dot. And his remains are being displayed at the county fair. And at the same time, just last night, I was watching a report on CNN. In fact, it was of indigenous people in the West who are protesting about a potential lithium mine. Lithium being very much in demand at the moment because of the explosion in battery demand for batteries for EVs, electric vehicles, and so on. Which happens to be the deposit happens to be at least partly under an ancient native burial ground, which
Mm.
they're protesting the potential turning it into a mine.
Mm.
So I mean, this does seem to fit into both a very a traditional American popular culture going right back into the 19th century, but also it raises some very up to the minute issues.
There is
Sorry, go
also
on.
a long history of um, museums not only retaining human remains, they don't deserve to keep from anthropological, historic collections. But we've even got the recent breaking news of the Penn Museum admitting that even though they've moved to restore the human remains that were analysed by their experts after the move bombing of 1985, that there's been protests that they still apparently may have human remains of at least one of the two children that were killed in that attack on a family home. Still, I mean, this is like recent history. Let forget
Mm.
1895. So I
Mm.
mean, I know it's easy for me to oh, you Brits with your British Museum, you can't criticize us, but America has in both its funerary industry, where there's been all manner of controversies about crematoria that don't actually burn the dead, through to um, museums and professional environments which should have really repatriated remains, and they don't. There's a lot to be sorted out here, and I know it's not the same as museums. I'm not equating it as exactly the same, but it does really beg a belief that we're in 2023 seeing this kind of sensationalizing freak show treatment of recently dead people and their remains. So as a bit of a high horse from me, but I feel there's a lot to be contended with here that is difficult to wrap up in it's educational, it's respectful. No, you're not. You're just continuing a long tradition, as you say, of a very slapdash and variegated attitude towards bodies that if people can get hold of them, they'll do something odd with them.
Is it?
I just point out to again, if our viewer wants a good read on this subject, 60 years ago, Jessica Mitford wrote a very famous book called The American Way of Death.
Yes,
exposing the American funerary industry in very similar terms to those you just described. I think, Howard. Mark, yeah. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Is it possible to make a slightly less knowing anthropological observation here in the last 5 minutes or so that we have, in so much as if we observed practices in a place that some people might say is a tribal way of living, whatever that means, it conjures up often in for example, news stories, etc., certain life path. If we observe people preserving the dead artificially and examining a body, and the body has no real identity, and it is put on a table somewhere, and people do come back to it, and so on and so forth. Or I suppose even, for example, if we look at in medieval Italy, there were some similar practices where bodies that are deemed to be saints or even popes, for example, are preserved in what appear to be slightly ghoulish ways, but become sort of almost part of a local character of a place. And in this instance, at the end of the story here, Blankenbiller, the owner of the funeral directors, said he's just been such an icon at our funeral home and a legend. We always greet his casket, "Hey Willie," when we pass it by. Is there a more sympathetic way of looking at this? And I'm not saying that there has to be, but in the same way that, as you say, yes, tradition builds up. For example, there are medical schools where bodies were basically preserved for examination, and they become kind of almost like a mascot of the school.
So for the people
Jeremy Bentham at University College London is the famous one, isn't he?
Yeah.
For those who are around and engaging with these bodies, they do become personal. They don't necessarily become possessions. They become friends. They are treating this rightly like a human remains, and they feel an attachment to him. And they've clearly been reluctant to let him go. And they really should have done this a long time ago. There is an affinity. There is an affinity between anybody who is in close contact, and it does. I think there's a story behind this. Why did it take them so long? Why now are they going through this burial?
Yeah. Can I just make a very, very quick anecdote, personal anecdote? My mum trained as a nurse in the 1950s, and she always told the story that when she was training at Ealing, they had a skeleton used in the classroom, and in those days they used real skeletons donated to medical science, not hopefully donated to medical science, not fabricated ones as are used very often nowadays. And one day they were taking photographs of themselves with their arms around Jimmy and his arm around theirs, personified by, he was called Jimmy. And they were discovered by the sister tutor, who tore them off a strip, saying, that was a person once. You treat them with respect.
Yeah. Although I just did a TikTok video where I used that plastic teaching skeleton to do a jokey, how do you know that they're dead? Are they breathing? Is there still flesh on the body? And obviously it was in jest, and I wouldn't have done that with actual human remains. But we should joke, and we should interact with human remains as people. And I don't think that we should. It's one thing saying it seems a bit hypocritical, doesn't it? This person has been fully what's the phrase? A wired up, teaching skeleton human remains. But you shouldn't have a joke about it. So I see different sides to that. But at the end of the day, we're all aware that we're dealing with bits of person, and we're still aware, even if they've been in teaching collections and medical collections for hundreds of years, that there's some responsibility, some obligation to resolve a body that's out of place, that's not concluded in its journey to the grave or to repose. And so I think it's only fitting that old Stoneman Willie gets a final burial. But honestly, I do happen to feel it's probably about a century late.
Definitely overdue.
And that's probably a good point to end our conversation this afternoon. And well, thank you very much, Professor Howard Williams, for joining us again on Watching Brief.
Been great, thank you.
Thank you. Stoneman Willie. A combination
as opposed to groundskeeper. I had to keep stopping myself thinking groundskeeper Willie from
that would have been quite bad, wouldn't it? But it's an interesting combination of words, definitely, and hopefully he is now finally put to rest and given the dignity that that we all hope for, I suppose. I mean, did you find this just slightly eye-opening then, as a sort of comparative mortuary story in terms of how we tend to treat the dead in Britain?
Yeah, I mean, I've always had an interest, as people who followed our conversations here on Watching Brief, also things that I've written about and been involved with and so on. But I've always had an interest in fringe archaeology, cryptozoology, where archaeology and folklore intersect. And a couple of things. When I read the story of Stoneman Willie, I immediately thought of both that tradition in the States of the county fair huckster getting people to pay their 10 cents to see the body of Billy the Kid or whatever.
Sort of a P.T. Barnum type figure. Yeah,
absolutely. But also in the 60s and 70s, the urban legends like the Minnesota Iceman. Or the alleged, anthropomorphic great apes that were supposedly flown back from Vietnam by GIs, and then were exhibited in fairgrounds and so on. So, and here you have almost a sort of slightly more respectable end of that tradition. And I thought it was just as a cultural story, it was fascinating. And yes, of course, now we hope that Stoneman Willie rests in peace and isn't walked at in the way that he has been for the last 120 plus years.
I do think it's worthwhile just reiterating, though, that it does seem as though there was a legitimate relationship built up between the people around those remains and Willie. But also, it's going to be nice just to see him with his name restored to him as well in the grave. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. One of the great American plays, The Crucible, hinges on John Proctor at the end of The Crucible chooses to be hanged as a witch rather than give up his good name. It's absolutely at the center of American culture, in the same way that the name of an individual was actually at the center of ancient Egyptian culture, and in Roman times, and the opponents of the state were subjected to damnatio memoriae, where their name was literally struck off monuments.
Name, memory, Well, not quite sure what we're going to be talking about in next week's Watching Brief, and I'm sure it will
more big ideas, just like that one that you can talk about and join us with talking about Below the Line.
Absolutely. You can also support the Watching Brief on Patreon. We do have a set of badges that are available on the Etsy store. I do know what was going to happen. We're going to have a mini episode at the beginning of next week, examining some headlines that we wanted to talk about this week, but time ran away from us. Anyway, until then, guys, do get involved below in the conversation and do take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.